In Athens, the cradle of democracy and philosophy, a night with a woman could cost less than a jug of sour wine. Not honor, not love, just 2 barley cakes, the price of hunger. So who paid for the glory of the city that gave us Socrates and the Parthenon? The chronicles fall silent here, but bones court speeches and graffiti whisper the missing story. Viewer discretion advised. Though not graphic, this tale is disturbing. If you value the historical record, subscribe. Because when the ledgers close, the voices of the forgotten still cry out. Athens, the city we celebrate as the birthplace of democracy. Theatre and philosophy concealed another truth beneath its marble temples and agora. In its state-regulated brothels, a woman's body could be bought for less than the price of a few loaves of bread. Court speeches from the orators of the time describe it without shame, as though the transaction were no different from buying olives or wine. The term for these women, pornai, reduced them to mere property bodies, to be rented, their humanity stripped by the very language that named them. These women were often enslaved, brought from distant lands, or forced into the trade from childhood. Archaeological evidence suggests some were as young as 10 or 12. Their thighs burned with brands of ownership that marked them as commodities for life. Writers like Lysias and Demosthenes mention them in passing, not to defend them, but to make political points, their suffering treated as background noise to the drama of male oratory. The economic logic was ruthless. Brothel owners grew rich, and a share of their profit flowed directly into the city's treasury through taxes. This meant the Athenian state itself profited from the degradation of women. While philosophers debated virtue in the symposium and tragedians staged plays about justice, the screams and exhaustion of enslaved women funded the city's festivals and its monuments. What was the cost of Athens's glory? Not measured in gold, but in broken bodies and silence. In this series, we will step into. The world rarely acknowledged the lives of the pornai, the rituals that crushed their spirits, the violence sold as entertainment, and the politics that erased them. To step into the brothels of Athens was to enter a world stripped bare of dignity, where women known as pornai, from which our modern word pornography derives, lived and died as property. They were not courtesans with silk robes and lyres, but the lowest tier of sex work in the ancient Greek hierarchy. Their price could be measured in barley cakes or cheap wine, their value calculated in transactions that reduced them to flesh for rent. Behind the white marble facades of temples and the lofty words of philosophers, the lives of the pornai were an open secret, tolerated, regulated, and ruthlessly exploited. Most pornai were enslaved. Some had been captured in war, dragged from conquered towns in Thrace, Asia Minor, or beyond the Black Sea. Others were sold by desperate parents, or even born into brothels, their first breaths taken in rooms already soaked with the cries of women. Archaeological finds confirm this brutal reality. Skeletal remains of young women with brands burned into their thighs, hot iron marks identifying them as the living property of their owners. Such branding was not symbolic. It was a scar meant to close off hope. It declared that escape, even freedom, would not erase the stigma. Branded flesh became a ledger, a permanent receipt inscribed on the body. The daily conditions were bleak. Brothels were crowded, poorly ventilated spaces where women were forced to work in open rooms, separated only by thin mats or dirty cloth. Privacy was non-existent. A woman's body was not her own, but a public commodity. Writers of the time describe the environment with casual indifference, as if the pain and exhaustion of these women were as ordinary as the clamour of the marketplace. Court speeches by Athenian orators mention them in passing to illustrate debts or insults, never as human beings with lives of their own. They were part of the backdrop of civic life, simultaneously visible and invisible. The harshness of their existence extended beyond exploitation. If a woman refused to work, punishment was swift and brutal. Whippings, starvation, and even public humiliation were routine. Runaways were not treated as human beings fleeing abuse, but as stolen goods. The law considered them the property of their owners, and any attempt to escape was prosecuted as theft. Some runaways were branded a second time, this time across the chest or forehead, seared into the flesh as a permanent stigma deserter. Others, according to grim accounts, were nailed to boards and left exposed in public squares, a spectacle of warning to other women who might dare imagine freedom. Yet, for all their suffering, the pornai were essential to Athens' economy. Brothel owners profited enormously, and the city itself taxed their earnings. In fact, Athens was among the first societies known to have state-regulated brothels, introduced under the lawgiver Solon in the 6th century BCE. The state profited from every transaction, making sexual exploitation not just a private business, but a public enterprise. The paradox is stark. The same democracy that excluded women from political life funded its civic life with their commodification. The age of these women deepens the horror. While courtesans known as hetairae were adults trained in music, wit, and conversation, the pornai were often girls barely entering puberty. Sources suggest some began service as young as 10 or 12. Their bodies not yet grown, but already treated as expendable tools for profit. The combination of youth and inexperience made them especially vulnerable to violence, both sexual and physical. Medical writings from the time record, torn flesh disease, and untreated infections, all considered part of the expected toll. The shorter their lives, the faster the cycle turned. New girls purchased, broken, and consumed. For the men of Athens, visiting a brothel was neither shameful nor secret. It was normalized, even expected. Comic plays by Aristophanes mention brothels and prostitutes as casually as taverns and wine. Philosophers might debate virtue and self-control in the symposium, but the city tolerated and even institutionalized the buying and selling of human bodies. The contradiction is glaring. A society that exalted rationality and human dignity allowed the systematic degradation of women at its core. This is not an accidental shadow, but a foundational truth of the Athenian world. The women themselves left no writings, no speeches, no philosophical defenses. Their voices survive only in fragments. Graffiti scratched on walls, skeletal remains found in excavations, passing mentions in court records. Yet, even in these fragments, their reality emerges with clarity. They were seen not as individuals, but as commodities, bought, branded, and discarded. Their humanity was erased, their existence reduced to profit margins and physical scars. And still, within this brutal economy, one truth remains. Athens, the city celebrated for its ideals of freedom and civic virtue, built part of its glory on the broken lives of enslaved women. To understand the greatness of Greece, we must also confront this silence, for behind the marble and memory lies the world of the pornai, a world where democracy profited from despair and philosophy looked the other way. To become a pawn in Athens was not simply to enter a brothel, but to undergo a ritual of breaking. Ancient sources, rare but chilling, describe what happened when a new girl arrived. She was often the youngest, sometimes no more than 12. Her body frail from the long journey of enslavement. The first night was staged not for her protection, but for her destruction. Brothel owners paraded her before patrons like a newly acquired piece of livestock. The ritualized violence that followed was meant to extinguish hope, to shatter her spirit before it could resist. One Thessalian account, preserved in later commentary, claims that this initiation took place in front of other women, who were forced to watch as both witnesses and reminders of their own past humiliation. The girl's body became a spectacle, her cries the entertainment of the crowd. This cruelty was not random, but calculated. A newly arrived girl was worth far more than a seasoned worker. Men paid 10 times the usual price for someone untouched by previous customers. Freshness was a commodity, and pain was part of the purchase. Writers of the time speak of these encounters with casual detachment, describing them as if one were selecting fruit from a stall. Such language stripped away empathy and turned suffering into commerce. It was not only the women who were exploited, but the very idea of womanhood, reduced to an economy of use and disposal. Life inside the brothel offered no reprieve. Privacy did not exist. Women worked in cramped rooms, separated only by thin cloths, their voices and cries audible to all. Customers came and went in quick succession, and a woman might be forced to serve 6 to 10 men in a single day. Exhaustion was constant disease rampant, and the air thick with smoke, sweat, and despair. Even rest brought no escape, for every corner of the brothel reminded them of their captivity. Punishment for disobedience was brutal and theatrical. A woman who refused a client might be stripped, beaten with leather straps or wooden clubs, or locked in dark, airless rooms for days without food or water. Loyal patrons were sometimes invited to participate in these punishments, inventing games of cruelty that turned suffering into amusement. A spilled cup of wine, a mispronounced name, or even a tear shed in front of a customer could provoke violence. Over time, women learned to hide their agony behind forced smiles. Tears only invited further beatings. The bodies of these women bore the record of their ordeals. Archaeologists have uncovered skeletons with broken ribs, healed fractures, and pelvic injuries consistent with repeated assaults. Some skulls show signs of blunt force trauma, others of burns and cuts. These bones, silent for centuries, now speak of the systematic violence that court speeches and philosophical texts ignored. They are the physical proof of lives lived as instruments of profit, discarded once their usefulness ended. And the cruelty did not stop with routine violence. Some brothels offered a darker commodity, pain itself. Customers could pay extra for the privilege of inflicting harm, slashing faces, leaving scars, or even crippling women permanently. Graffiti on ancient walls records boasts of these acts as though cruelty were a badge of honor. A woman's scream became for some a kind of music, a drunken melody for men who confused domination with pleasure. The city itself turned away. The law did not recognize these women as human beings with rights, but as property, whose value lay only in their capacity to generate income. To assault a prostitute was not considered a crime against her person, but a damage to her owner's property, the way one might complain if a neighbor broke a slave's arm or damaged a plow. In this system, justice did not belong to the women. It belonged to the men who owned them. In Athens, the same city that exalted philosophy democracy and beauty violence against women was normalized, commodified, and even celebrated. It was entertainment in festivals, profit in markets, and silence in the courts. The initiation ritual that crushed a young girl on her first night was not an aberration. It was the foundation of a system designed to strip away humanity and replace it with obedience. And in that silence, the city thrived, feeding off the bodies of the most vulnerable while praising itself as the beacon of civilization. To understand how Athens viewed its enslaved prostitutes, we must look beyond the brothel doors into the cold logic of categorization. These women were not seen as individuals with names, families, or stories. They were merchandise sorted into degrading categories that defined both their market price and the manner in which they would be treated. Owners catalogued them as one might catalogue livestock, according to ethnicity, physical appearance, perceived defects, and willingness to obey. Each attribute became a line on an invisible ledger, converting human life into a commodity scale. Ethnicity was often the first marker. Nubian women, Thracians, Scythians, and Anatolians were grouped and priced by origin. To the Greek imagination, each people carried a stereotype, which was then mapped onto the bodies of enslaved women. Thracian women were painted as wild and fiery, therefore desirable to men who wanted novelty. Nubian women were exoticized, fetishized, their very difference from the Greek norm marketed as a lure. Others were devalued women with physical impairments or speech difficulties, were often sold for less advertised, as curiosities to men who sought strangeness rather than companionship. Even disabilities were commodified, reshaped into market niches for cruelty. But the most chilling category was obedience. Women were assessed on whether they resisted or submitted. Those who fought back were paradoxically marketed as more valuable in certain contexts. Graffiti and anecdotes suggest that some men paid extra for the thrill of overpowering a resisting woman. Brothel owners encouraged this by maintaining categories: the meek, the compliant, and the rebellious. Rebellion itself became a sales pitch. Violence was not an accident of the system, but one of its selling points. Competitions even emerged around this perverse market. Some sources hint at drinking games or wagers, where men tested their strength against women who had been instructed or forced to resist. These encounters were framed not as crimes, but as spectacles. Private contests of masculinity, with a human being as the arena. 5th century artwork on pottery depicts scenes where groups of men grapple with women, sometimes laughing, sometimes jeering. To the Athenians, who used such vessels at symposia, these images were not shameful. They were entertainment decorations for the cups from which they drank wine. Visual jokes passed around the table as casually as bread or olives. The commodification reached absurd extremes. Brothel keepers invented elaborate pricing schemes, more for the youngest, less for the older. Surcharges for certain acts, discounts for others. Some women were labelled as unbroken, meaning they had not yet been subjected to the full brutality of repeated service. Their price skyrocketed, and they were marketed as luxury items for the wealthiest clients. Others were categorized as damaged goods scarred by beatings or disease and sold cheaply to the poor. In either case, the humanity of the woman vanished beneath the stamp of commerce. This system of categories reveals the chilling rationality of exploitation. It was not chaos, not random cruelty, but an organized market in which violence and degradation were structured, priced, and normalized. By fragmenting women into types exotic, defective, obedient, rebellious, the owners stripped away individuality and replaced it with labels that justified abuse. To strike, to scar, to overpower became not acts of barbarity, but commodities bought and sold in the open. Athens, the city that praised itself as a beacon of reason, used reason itself to refine cruelty. The same minds that organized laws and festivals also organized women's suffering into categories of sale. When we look at these classifications preserved in art, graffiti, and scattered records, we see not the chaos of vice, but the order of commerce. The women were no longer simply enslaved. They were inventory. And in that transformation lay the deepest violence of all. If the daily life of Athens' prostitutes was a relentless cycle of sale and suffering, then the religious calendar offered no respite. Instead, festivals turned their misery into ritual, framing exploitation as sacred duty. The most disturbing scenes unfolded during the great celebrations of Dionysus, the god of wine frenzy and ecstasy, where boundaries dissolved and violence was cloaked in the language of worship. The Dionysia was the pride of Athens, a festival that brought the entire city together to watch new tragedies and comedies, to honor the god who symbolized both fertility and chaos. Yet, behind the splendor of the theater lay another spectacle, one that unfolded in private courtyards and drunken processions. Prostitutes, especially enslaved pornae, were handed over to groups of men for free use. Their bodies offered not for profit, but as communal tribute. To the priests who oversaw the rites, this was not abuse, but sacrifice, a way of honoring Dionysus through excess. Ancient accounts describe the atmosphere. Wine poured endlessly, music rising to fever pitch, and men intoxicated to the point of frenzy. The women dragged into the center of the revel were overwhelmed by numbers jeered at and stripped of even the thin pretense of transaction. On these days, their labor was not simply coerced but erased. They were denied even the logic of commerce, their worth reduced to nothing, their pain justified as part of a sacred act. The violence was ritualized. Priests insisted that the mingling of wine and blood upon the ground was pleasing to Dionysus. In some cases, women's cries were interpreted as prayers, their suffering reframed as offerings for abundance. To those watching the spectacle was not an abomination, but a tradition. The city could convince itself that cruelty was sanctity, that desecration was devotion. Archaeological traces support these accounts. Pottery fragments depict scenes of revelers assaulting women amid processions, laughter painted alongside flutes and garlands. Scholars debate whether these images were symbolic or documentary, but either way, they reflect a world where such violence was imaginable, even normal. Inscriptions record fines or dedications made during festivals, suggesting the brothels themselves were intertwined with the ritual economy. Taxes and offerings were paid, with the same coin linking the cries of women to the funding of religious life. The paradox is sharp. On the stage of the Dionysia, Athenians wept at the tragedies of Euripides, grieving for fictional heroines like Medea or Hecuba. Yet, in the same festival, real women suffered without sympathy, their bodies used as playthings in the shadows of the theatre. Art ennobled pain when it was performed, ritual erased pain when it was lived. The hypocrisy is almost unbearable compassion for a character, indifference to a neighbor. For the women themselves, the festivals must have been among the darkest days. If ordinary work brought exhaustion and humiliation, the Dionysia brought exposure, degradation, without even the protection of price. To be offered freely, as though their lives were nothing more than vessels of pleasure for the crowd, was to feel the deepest negation of self. The festival that claimed to unite the city through shared joy, in fact deepened their isolation, marking them not as Athenians, but as sacrifices. The priests' men of authority legitimized this cruelty. By declaring it sacred, they closed the door to protest. To resist was not simply to defy a man, but to defy a god. Religion, which should have offered solace, became a weapon of control, binding women even more tightly to their suffering. Thus, the festivals reveal the true extent of Athens' contradictions. The city that celebrated democracy and theatre also sanctified abuse, turning the degradation of women into communal ritual. What was sold daily in brothels was on feast days, given freely reframed as worship. Wine mixed with blood, laughter mixed with screams, and Athens called it sacred. If festivals turned abuse into ritual, the ordinary days of a brothel turned punishment into routine. Discipline was not an exception, but a system as regular as the opening of the doors to customers. Owners developed methods to ensure that women obeyed, and these methods were not hidden. They were enforced in ways that every woman in the house could witness, reminders etched daily into flesh and memory. The most common punishment was the beating. A woman who refused a client, faltered in performance, or even displayed exhaustion could be whipped with leather straps, struck with wooden clubs, or slapped until her face swelled. Sometimes patrons were invited to participate in these punishments as part of their entertainment. A customer could pay to inflict the lash himself, blurring the line between discipline and sale. Violence was no longer simply a tool of control, but an additional commodity, marketed alongside wine and flesh. Starvation was another weapon. Women who resisted were denied food or water, sometimes for days, until their will broke. Locking a woman in a dark, airless room was common practice, the silence and hunger pressing down as heavily as chains. Others were tied in courtyards left under the blazing Athenian sun or the damp chill of winter nights. Their suffering was meant to be visible. A warning to the rest, obedience was survival. Disobedience was agony. These cruelties were cynically labeled character correction, as if the breaking of the human spirit was a form of moral instruction. The punishments could be inventive, even theatrical. Owners devised games where women were forced to crawl, carry heavy loads, or endure degrading tasks purely to humiliate them. The degradation itself became part of the spectacle, reducing women to objects of ridicule before their peers. Such games echo the cruelty of Roman gladiatorial contests, where suffering was turned into entertainment for the masses. In Athens, the arena was smaller, the audience narrower, but the logic was the same: human pain, packaged as spectacle, normalized as daily life. The scars of these punishments were not only physical, but psychological. Women learned that any sign of resistance, even a tear shed at the wrong moment, could provoke violence. They forced themselves to mask agony with false smiles, to swallow despair in silence. Over time, survival depended on invisibility, on becoming so compliant, so unnoticeable, that punishment might fall on someone else. Yet, even invisibility could not shield them, for cruelty was as much arbitrary as it was systematic. To live in the brothel was to live under constant threat, where any gesture, any glance could be twisted into grounds for pain. Archaeological evidence confirms the brutality. Skeletons unearthed near brothel districts bear the marks of repeated trauma ribs fractured and healed skulls cracked by blunt force spines bent from unnatural strain. These bones speak more honestly than the orators or philosophers who rarely acknowledge such realities. They reveal a world where punishment was not occasional correction, but the rhythm of life, where violence shaped every aspect of existence. And yet the system was profitable. Fear was efficient. A woman broken by beatings was easier to control, less likely to resist, more likely to serve silently. Punishment was not waste, but investment, ensuring that owners maintained their profits and customers their satisfaction. In this logic, cruelty was not excess, but necessity. The body was both tool and target worked until it yielded coin punished, until it yielded obedience. The comparison with Rome's gladiatorial games is telling. Both systems relied on human suffering for profit and entertainment. Both transformed cruelty into spectacle. But where Rome staged its violence in amphitheaters for tens of thousands, Athens confined its punishments to brothels' alleys and courtyards. Smaller in scale, no less in cruelty. And just as Roman crowds cheered at bloodshed, Athenian patrons laughed at the punishments they helped inflict, convinced that such acts were part of the natural order. The hypocrisy cannot be ignored. Athens, which boasted of reason, balance, and self-control, sanctioned a system that rewarded cruelty, that made the breaking of women a daily practice. Its laws regulated brothels, its treasury taxed their earnings, but its conscience remained silent. To punish was to profit, and profit justified all. For the women, every day was a gamble with pain. Work too slowly, and the whip fell. Cry too loudly, and food was withheld. Show too much spirit, and humiliation was staged. Life itself was reduced to a choice between obedience and torment, between silence and scars. It was not a system of correction, but of control, a machinery of fear that ensured profit through suffering. This was Athens' hidden theatre, invisible, beside the grand tragedies of the Dionysia. On its small, brutal stage, women played their roles under duress, punished not for crimes, but for existing as property. The city of democracy rehearsed cruelty here every day, ensuring that its ideals of freedom stood firmly on the backs of those who had none. For women trapped in the brothels of Athens, escape shimmered like a mirage, always visible, always out of reach. To dream of running away was to imagine a life beyond branding, beyond beatings, beyond the endless cycle of sale. But the city and its laws had already prepared for such dreams. In Athens, the body of an enslaved prostitute was legally property, and to flee was not seen as reclaiming freedom, but as theft. A runaway woman was a stolen object, an absconded tool whose flight was an insult not only to her owner, but to the entire system of control. The mechanisms of capture were ruthless. Slave catchers, sometimes hired by brothel owners, patrolled the streets armed with chains and whips. Informants lurked in taverns, ready to betray a fleeing woman for coin. Even if she reached the temples, those sanctuaries meant to shield the desperate. The promise of divine refuge often failed. Priests swayed by bribes or bound by loyalty to the wealthy frequently returned fugitives to their owners. Accounts hint at grim scenes, women dragged screaming from the steps of altars, their fingernails torn as they clutched sacred stone. At dawn, the temple floors were scrubbed clean, the blood of the desperate washed away, as if piety itself demanded silence. And when a runaway was caught, punishment was swift and merciless. Branding was the most common penalty. A red-hot iron pressed against forehead cheek or chest marked the woman forever as a deserter. The scar was not only physical, it was social. An unhealable stigma that declared her disobedience to every future buyer-client or passer-by. Others faced even harsher fates. Contemporary legal fragments and later commentaries describe women nailed to wooden boards and displayed in public spaces. Crucifixion was not a Roman invention alone. In Greece too, bodies could be pinned up as warnings. For a runaway prostitute, her suffering became spectacle, a deterrent to others who might have dared to hope. The message was clear. Escape was worse than impossible. It was punishable beyond endurance. Women who remained in the brothels witnessed these punishments, the branded scars, the broken bodies hung in the marketplace. Fear was cultivated not just through direct violence, but through example. Each punishment reverberated like a lesson. Obedience meant survival, defiance meant annihilation. What made the cruelty sharper was its hypocrisy. Athens prided itself on liberty, on the freedom of its citizens to debate in the assembly, to shape the destiny of their polis. Yet, liberty was defined so narrowly that it excluded entire populations, slaves, foreigners, women, and most of all, enslaved prostitutes. Their attempt to claim the same freedom, celebrated in marble inscriptions, was punished as treason. For a man, freedom was a right. For a woman in bondage, it was a crime, and still women tried. The desperation for autonomy outweighed the certainty of punishment. Some ran to the countryside hiding among shepherds or fleeing to port towns, hoping to lose themselves in the anonymity of trade. Others sought the gods, throwing themselves before statues, hoping that divine mercy would succeed where human mercy failed. A few even tried to pass as free women, dressing modestly, inventing false stories, blending into the crowd. These attempts rarely succeeded, but they reveal an uncrushable truth. Even in the face of systemic terror, the human spirit resisted. Archaeological traces offer haunting confirmations. Inscriptions note fines levied on owners whose slaves fled, indicating that runaways were common enough to require legal regulation. Temple graffiti scratched into stone, pleas for protection carved in crude letters, may well have been the last words of women dragged away. These faint voices survive where official records remain silent. They testify not only to suffering, but to defiance fragile yet enduring. In the end, the retribution system was not simply about punishing individuals. It was about maintaining an economy of fear. The branded forehead, the nailed body, the stains on temple steps. These were symbols meant to terrify every woman still in bondage, ensuring obedience through the memory of terror. For the city, it was efficient. For the women, it was devastating. Athens, the polis that taught the world to praise freedom, sustained its democracy by crushing the freedom of those who sought it most desperately. Escape and retribution reveal the true cost of the system: liberty for some, terror for others. And the women who dared to run, who reached for the promise of freedom, and remind us that even in the darkest cages, the human will resists the silence imposed upon it. To endure in the brothels of Athens was not truly to live. It was to survive by inches. One transaction, one blow, one breath at a time. Survival itself had a price, and it was often measured not in years, but in the slow erosion of the body. Few women lived beyond their mid-20s. their lives were consumed by the brutal arithmetic of an economy that valued fresh bodies more than the preservation of the ones it already owned. Medical neglect was not an accident of poverty, but a deliberate calculation. A physician's visit cost more than the purchase of a new girl. Why invest in healing when the market offered an endless supply of replacements from Thrace, Anatolia, Nubia, or the slums of Athens itself? Owners weighed health not in terms of humanity, but in terms of profit margins. A cough, a festering wound, a limp. These were not ailments to be treated, but signs that a woman's use value was nearly spent. She would continue working until she collapsed, and only then would her disposal be arranged. The evidence of this neglect lingers in bones unearthed beneath ancient districts. Archaeologists have recovered skeletons bearing the marks of relentless violence and untreated injuries. Pelvic bones fractured by repeated assaults, skulls with healed depressions from blunt trauma evidence that blows had been endured, not cured. Ribs set at odd angles, suggesting breaks that were never properly mended. Spinal deformities from years of strain in positions of forced labor. These remains speak more truthfully than the polished marble of temples or the words of philosophers. They whisper of bodies broken not by accident, but by design. Contemporary writings confirm what the bones reveal. Court speeches concerned not with compassion, but with property disputes describe women who had been rendered useless by illness or exhaustion. Their owners spoke of them as one might speak of a damaged tool or worn-out plough. Even philosophers, who otherwise pondered justice and virtue, showed little interest in extending these concepts to enslaved prostitutes. Their suffering was invisible to the very thinkers who gave us the language of ethics. Disease spread quickly in the cramped quarters of brothels. Skin infections, respiratory illness, and sexually transmitted diseases were rampant. Hippocratic texts, often celebrated for their rational approach to medicine, contain casual mentions of treatments for men infected by intercourse. But the women who carried the diseases were rarely considered patients. Their sickness was seen only as a hazard to clients, not as a condition deserving care. For the women, pain became constant, untreated, normalized. Even in the rare cases when treatment was attempted, it was often crude and cruel. Herbal concoctions induced violent vomiting or bleeding. Burns were cauterized with hot irons, more torture than remedy. Bones were bound with rough splints that cut into the flesh. Infection, fever, and slow decline followed. Yet, women kept working, compelled by force, threatened with starvation, or worse, if they dared to rest. To be sick was not an excuse. It was a liability that could accelerate one's death. What makes this neglect so striking is its deliberate nature. In modern terms, it was a system of cost-benefit analysis. The state itself profited from brothels through taxation, meaning that neglect was not simply private cruelty, but part of a wider economic order. Every untreated wound, every death hastened by exhaustion, was absorbed into the machinery of Athenian prosperity. The sick and injured were cheaper to discard than to heal, and this truth was written into the financial logic of the city. Still, some women resisted by clinging to survival in whatever ways they could. They shared scraps of food, whispered knowledge of herbs, and tended wounds in secret. Archaeological traces suggest women buried tokens or amulets beneath floors' charms against illness or despair. Such gestures reveal a quiet resilience, attempts to reclaim even the smallest fragment of control over their fates. But the system was relentless, designed to grind away hope as much as health. The cost of survival then was twofold. It consumed the body, leaving scars that archaeology still uncovers. And it consumed the soul, forcing women to live in a state where endurance itself was punished. Survival was never guaranteed, only prolonged suffering under the cold logic of profit. Athens celebrated its temples, its philosophers, its ideals of beauty and reason. Yet, beneath the city's brilliance lay bodies abandoned to rot women who paid with their health and lives so that others could sip wine and debate virtue. In these bones, we find the truest measure of survival, not triumph, not dignity, but a testimony carved into flesh and marrow. Survival was not a gift. It was the slow expenditure of human life in the service of a society that refused to see them as human at all. For the women trapped in Athenian brothels, death often arrived not as a sudden release, but as the final stage of neglect. The average lifespan for an enslaved prostitute was brutally short. Many never saw their 30th year, their bodies ravaged by disease. Repeated assaults, starvation, and untreated injuries simply collapsed under the weight of unrelenting exploitation. Yet, even death did not grant them dignity. In a society that adorned its fallen warriors with laurel wreaths and eternal poetry, these women were denied even a grave. When a woman died, her passing rarely warranted ceremony. Owners treated her body as they had treated her life, as property. Discarded when no longer profitable, corpses were carried beyond the city walls and dumped into ravines, rubbish heaps, or shallow pits. Archaeological digs around Athens have uncovered chilling evidence of this practice. Female skeletons have been found mingled with pottery shards, animal bones, and household refuse, proof that their remains were thrown away like broken vessels. There were no funerary rites, no markers, no names etched in stone. The women who had been used and discarded in life were erased in death. Even more haunting are the remains of infants found in drainage channels and refuse pits near brothel sites. Tiny bones, fragile and incomplete, speak of forced abortions and infanticide. Some newborns were drowned or abandoned. Others were left to die of neglect. Their mothers themselves, enslaved and powerless, had no authority to protect them. A pregnancy was not a cause for joy, but a threat to profit, a liability that devalued the woman in the eyes of her owner. Infants were thus treated as waste, their short lives extinguished before they could even enter the city's records. The presence of these bones is a silent but undeniable testimony. The violence inflicted on women did not end with them. It extended into the next generation. This deliberate erasure was not incidental, but systematic. In Athenian custom, burial was sacred, a duty owed to the dead, so that their souls could rest. To deny someone a proper burial was to condemn them to eternal unrest, to cast them outside the order of both city and cosmos. By denying prostitutes these rights, Athens made a clear statement. These women did not belong to the moral or civic community. They were unworthy of memory. In a culture obsessed with immortality through reputation, the deliberate forgetting of these women was itself a form of violence. The contrast is staggering. Citizens who fell in battle were celebrated with elaborate funerals, their names immortalized in inscriptions, their deeds sung in tragedy. Even ordinary free citizens could expect modest rituals to secure their passage to the afterlife. But enslaved prostitutes were erased. Their suffering, their endurance, their humanity all consigned to silence. This act of forgetting was as powerful as any physical chain. It ensured that their stories would vanish, that their existence would not burden the conscience of the city that profited from their exploitation. And yet, despite this erasure, fragments of their presence endure. Archaeology recovers what history tried to suppress. Bones tell stories of broken lives. Graffiti scrawled on walls names please. Insults offer glimpses of voices that refuse to be fully silenced. Even literary texts written from the perspective of elites occasionally let slip casual references to these women, revealing how deeply embedded their exploitation was in Athenian society. Together, these fragments resist the attempt at obliteration. They whisper across centuries, "We were here." Death and erasure reveal the final cruelty of Athens' system. It was not enough to exploit women in life. The city also sought to strip them of memory in death. To be forgotten was to be condemned twice, first in flesh, then in history. But by piecing together the bones, the refuse, the inscriptions, we can begin to restore what was taken. Their names may not survive, but their truth can. Athens built its glory on the backs of these women, yet tried to bury not only their bodies, but their stories. Today, by remembering them, we undo part of that erasure. Their silence was enforced. Our act of listening is resistance. Death may have taken them, but it need not keep them forgotten. In the brothels of Athens, pregnancy was not regarded as a natural cycle of life, nor as a sacred moment to be protected. It was considered damage to property. A woman's body was valued only so long as it could generate profit. A pregnancy threatened that rhythm of exploitation, interfering with her availability to clients, diminishing her owner's income, and raising the unwelcome possibility of additional mouths to feed. Where a free citizen might celebrate fertility as a gift of the gods, enslaved prostitutes were punished for it. The measures taken to prevent or end pregnancies were as brutal as they were varied. Ancient medical texts, often admired today for their proto-scientific observations, record grim recipes meant to induce abortion herbs such as silphium rue and pennyroyal, administered in doses so strong they caused violent convulsions, hemorrhaging, or poisoning. Some mixtures worked, many simply destroyed the woman's health. When herbal concoctions failed, cruder methods followed. Women were forced to carry heavy loads until they collapsed, struck repeatedly in the abdomen, or subjected to invasive instruments, sharpened sticks, or crude probes inserted with no concern for infection or agony. These were not treatments, but punishments disguised as remedies. Even when pregnancies continued, there was no reprieve. Births took place on the same filthy straw mats where clients had come hours earlier. There were no midwives, no clean water, no medicines to ease the labor. Infants arrived into an environment of filth and exhaustion. For the mother's blood loss and infection were common, and many did not survive beyond the birth itself. For the infant's survival was even rarer. Archaeologists have uncovered tiny bones in refuse pits and drainage channels behind brothels, mute witnesses to lives cut short almost as soon as they began. Infanticide was not only tolerated, but expected. Male infants might sometimes be spared if an owner saw the potential to raise a future slave, but girls were almost always discarded. A newborn girl represented future competition or another body to be exploited. The act of killing or abandoning infants became so normalized that it scarcely registered in surviving records, appearing as casual references rather than scandalous crimes. This silence in the sources reflects not absence, but acceptance. a chilling reminder of how deeply ingrained the practice was in the social fabric. For the women themselves, pregnancy was a paradox of suffering. Many feared it, knowing it would bring pain, punishment, and perhaps death. Yet some must have experienced flickers of hope that a child might provide a bond, a small shard of love in a life otherwise stripped of tenderness. That hope was almost always crushed. A woman who tried to hide her pregnancy risked brutal discovery. Those who gave birth in secret sometimes attempted to keep their infants alive, feeding them scraps or nursing them in stolen moments. But the chances of success were vanishingly small. Discovery meant the child's immediate death and often punishment for the mother. The tragedy of pregnancy lay not only in the violence of its prevention or the cruelty of its aftermath, but in its deliberate erasure from public memory. Athenian culture celebrated motherhood in its art and literature. Statues honored mothers with infants' myths, exalted maternal devotion, and rituals marked the importance of fertility to the survival of the polis. Yet none of this reverence extended to the enslaved prostitutes who carried unwanted pregnancies in the brothels. Their suffering was excluded from the cultural narrative. They were denied the dignity of motherhood just as they were denied the dignity of proper burial. The contrast is staggering. On the Nix, orators praised the blessings of the city's gods, attributing prosperity to divine favor and fertility. Meanwhile, in the back alleys, women endured forced abortions or gave birth to children whose cries would never be heard beyond the brothel walls. The same society that honored Demeter and Artemis as protectors of women and childbirth turned its back on those whose wombs it exploited. The archaeological record refuses to let us forget. The tiny bones in drains, the crude medical instruments recovered from domestic contexts, the terse mentions in court cases all reveal the unspoken truth that Athens, for all its glory, sustained itself on practices that annihilated life as much as it celebrated it. The tragedy of pregnancy in the brothels exposes the rawest contradiction of a civilization that claimed to revere beauty family and the divine order. To speak of it now is not simply to expose cruelty, but to recognize resilience. Each pregnancy carried to term, however doomed, was an act of endurance by women whose voices were denied. Each tiny skeleton unearthed forces us to reckon with a silence imposed 2,000 years ago. These women did not choose the conditions of their lives, but they endured them, and in the traces they left behind, they compel us to remember what Athens tried to erase. Not every woman in the brothels of Athens lived in the same conditions. A small number were lifted from the common rooms to become favorites, courtesans, concubines, or private mistresses of wealthy patrons. To the outside world, these women appeared to have escaped the worst degradations. They were draped in fine garments adorned with jewelry, given private quarters, away from the crowded chambers. They entertained elite men with music, poetry, or witty conversation. Some even influenced politics or culture from the peripheries of power. But beneath the silks and marble floors, the chain was still there. The courtesan or hetaira was a role that stood apart from the lowly pawn. Hetairai attended symposia, reclining among philosophers and generals, offering not only their bodies, but also companionship and intellect. Writers like Xenophon and Plato mention their presence at feasts, where they were praised for charm and cleverness. For some men, keeping a favored woman was a mark of status, proof of wealth and refinement. These women could become famous, their names known throughout Athens, their portraits painted on pottery, their lovers composing verses in their honor. Yet, glamour disguised dependence. Every gift of silk, every golden necklace, every comfortable bed was contingent on the whim of a man. The courtesan who pleased her patron might live in luxury, but if she angered him, bored him, or simply aged out of desirability, she could be cast back into the ranks of the brothel without hesitation. Unlike wives whose marriages were reinforced by law and kinship favorites had no legal protection. They existed in a liminal space, praised, admired, and even envied, but always vulnerable. Even at the height of favor, their lives remained transactional. A wealthy Athenian might treat his mistress as a prized possession, but he might also lend her to a visiting guest, as though offering fine wine or a prized hunting dog. Ancient anecdotes reveal this chilling casualness. Women were shared among friends, returned the next morning with no acknowledgement of their personhood. In such exchanges, the gilded cage revealed its bars. The illusion of freedom was perhaps the cruelest part. Unlike the pornae locked in filthy rooms, courtesans could move through elite spaces, converse with statesmen, or even accumulate wealth of their own. Some managed to purchase small estates, commission art, or even secure manumission, but their social standing remained precarious. A freed courtesan still carried the stain of her past. Respectable households barred them. Marriage into citizen families was impossible, and their children were denied legitimacy. For all their accomplishments, society refused to see them as equal to honorable women. The contrast between privilege and bondage was stark. In the same city, one enslaved prostitute could die nameless in a ditch, while another dined with generals. Yet, both were caught in the same system. Their lives illustrate the dual face of exploitation, degradation at the bottom, gilded confinement at the top. The apparent rise from misery to luxury did not break the cycle. It reinforced it, proving that Athens could transform women into ornaments, as easily as it had reduced others to refuse. Even those who became legends carried the shadow of their condition. Aspasia, the famous companion of Pericles, was admired for her intellect and rhetorical skill, yet vilified in comedy as a whore corrupting the statesman. Her fame reveals both possibility and peril. A woman could step into history's spotlight, but she could not escape its scorn. The cultural memory of Hetairae reflects this tension. They were simultaneously celebrated and condemned, elevated and debased. Ultimately, the story of favored women was not one of freedom, but of fragile reprieve. Their jewels could be stripped, their fine rooms abandoned, their patrons gone. They lived in cages gilded with luxury, but cages nonetheless. The Athenian system ensured that even its most privileged women remained property, their value tied to youth, beauty, and obedience. The tragedy of these favored women is not only that they were enslaved, but that their apparent elevation concealed the cruelty of their condition. They remind us that privilege within oppression is never freedom, only a different mask for the same captivity. Their stories reveal how exploitation adapts, disguising itself in silks and perfumes, but always rooted in control. Time was the most ruthless enemy of every woman caught in Athens' brothel system. For the pawn forced into daily exhaustion, decline came swiftly. For the courtesan swathed in silks, it came more slowly, cushioned by privilege, but no less certain. In both cases, youth and beauty, the very currencies of survival, slipped away. Once they were gone, the system had no use for the women who had given their bodies, their health, and their very lives to sustain it. The decline was visible long before age set in. Repeated pregnancies, whether ended by violence or carried to tragic term, left lasting damage. Infections from untreated wounds spread silently through the body. Malnutrition, hollowed cheeks, weakened bones, dulled hair. The women forced to entertain dozens of men a day, aged at double speed, their bodies worn thin by the relentless pace of their exploitation. By their mid-20s, many looked decades older. A few courtesans, carefully maintained by wealthy patrons, lingered longer in the glow of desirability. But the passing of time was inevitable. Lines around the eyes, graying strands of hair, or even the faintest hint of weariness could spell the end. And when decline came, the system showed no mercy. Some women were discarded outright, sold cheaply to harsher brothels, or forced back into the lowest ranks. Others too ill or too scarred to be sold again were abandoned. The archaeological record speaks here, with a grim voice. Skeletons of women found in rubbish heaps, their bones mingled with animal remains and broken pottery evidence that they were cast aside like refuse once their value had expired. This was not symbolic erasure, but deliberate denial of dignity. Even in death, their bodies testified to their disposability. For the courtesans who had once enjoyed comfort, the fall could be particularly brutal. A wealthy patron who tired of his mistress might dismiss her without warning. The fine rooms and silken robes vanished, and she returned to obscurity, or worse. Some tried to save wealth while they were favored, but without citizenship or legal standing, they were vulnerable to confiscation, theft, or betrayal. A courtesan's estate could be seized by her former lover, her supposed protector, or even the city itself. Her brief elevation left no protection against the inevitable descent. Even those who managed to buy their freedom remained stained by stigma. A freed prostitute was not welcomed into Athenian society. She could not marry a citizen, her children could not inherit legitimacy, and her reputation followed her everywhere. She became a social ghost, alive, but excluded, present, but invisible. The stain of her past ensured that she hovered at the margins, unable to escape the shadow of the brothel. The Greeks spoke often of kleos glory, the immortality of reputation. Warriors achieved it in battle, statesmen in debate, poets in verse. But the women whose bodies sustained the very economy of Athens were denied even memory. Their decline ended not in statues or epitaphs, but in silence. No one sang of them, no one carved their names into stone. Their legacy was absence carefully constructed by a society that preferred to forget the cost of its pleasures. And yet even in this silence, traces of resistance can be felt. Some courtesans cultivated wit, beauty, and influence to carve out space in elite circles. Others saved coin in secret dreaming of escape. A few managed to pass into history's margins, remembered in anecdote or scandal. But these were exceptions that proved the rule. Decline was unavoidable, and society had already written the script. The women began as commodities, and when their bodies no longer yielded profit, they were cast aside. The inevitability of decline reveals the cold machinery of exploitation. Athens could elevate a woman, briefly showering her with wealth and attention. But the moment her youth waned, the city stripped her of value. In this way, the system recycled cruelty, feeding on new bodies while discarding the old. The cycle of rise and fall, privilege and abandonment was not accidental. It was the very design of the trade. For the women themselves, decline must have been felt as both terror and resignation. To watch time steal away the only source of protection they had, youth and beauty was to watch death approach in slow motion. Some tried to cling to patrons, some to secure scraps of independence, but most faced the truth that their bodies would be left behind in silence. In Athens, decline was not merely natural aging, it was weaponized, turned into justification for disposal. The inevitability of decline was the inevitability of erasure, and that perhaps is the sharpest cruelty of all. To the Athenians, cruelty was not only a hidden feature of their society, it was entertainment. The violence inflicted on enslaved prostitutes seeped out of brothels and into public culture, where it was normalized, aestheticized, and sometimes even celebrated. Their suffering became a theme in art, a punchline in comedy, and a spectacle for men who claimed to be connoisseurs of virtue and beauty. The theatre cornerstone of Athenian identity was among the most telling arenas for this transformation of pain into amusement. In tragedies, Athenians wept for fictional queens who lost their sons or mythical women who endured exile. But in comedies, the enslaved prostitute became an easy target for ridicule. Playwrights like Aristophanes casually inserted jokes about beatings, whippings, and sexual exploitation. Audiences roared with laughter as characters mimicked women pleading for mercy or being dragged by their hair. These scenes did not create the cruelty. They reflected the culture that already accepted it. Laughter became complicity. At symposia, where wine and philosophy mingled, cruelty became an after-dinner sport. Courtesans might be asked to sing or dance, but pornae were sometimes forced to endure humiliation as part of the evening's amusement. Guests wagered on which woman would cry first under punishment, or how long she could resist being overpowered. Ancient anecdotes hint at these competitions staged not in shadowy corners, but openly as part of convivial bonding among men. Violence was turned into a game woven into the very fabric of elite male sociability. The art of the period reveals the same contradictions. Painted pottery, admired today in museums for its craftsmanship, often depicts scenes of sexual domination, sometimes veiled in mythological disguise, sometimes starkly realistic. One kylix shows a satyr forcing himself on a struggling woman. Another depicts a symposium where a nude girl performs for laughing men. To the Athenian viewer, these images were not shocking, they were familiar. They adorned wine cups, dinner vessels, everyday objects. Violence against women was not hidden. It was aestheticized into daily life. Graffiti found on the walls of brothels and taverns adds another layer. Crude sketches and inscriptions mock women's bodies, boast of violent encounters, or reduce them to prices. Some graffiti describe competitions, who struck the hardest, who left the deepest mark. The very walls of Athens bore witness to the transformation of cruelty into entertainment, as though the city itself recorded the laughter of those who profited from pain. Even philosophy did not stand apart. While thinkers like Socrates or Plato seldom spoke directly of brothels, their silence was itself telling. Discussions of justice virtue and the ideal polis coexisted with the reality of systematic exploitation just streets away. The suffering of prostitutes was not debated. It was ignored, deemed unworthy of intellectual concern. This selective blindness allowed Athens to cultivate a culture of high ideals while living daily with normalized cruelty. The hypocrisy was stark. In public rituals, Athenians honored Demeter, goddess of fertility, and praised the sanctity of motherhood. In poetry, they exalted the beauty of the female form idealized in marble statues and verses about goddesses. Yet, These same ideals were set alongside jokes about prostitutes beaten in the marketplace, or art showing women reduced to ornaments of suffering. The contradiction was not hidden. It was absorbed into the culture. For the women themselves, this cultural appropriation of their pain must have been devastating. Their cries were heard, but only as punchlines. Their bruises were visible, but only as aesthetic motifs. Their lives were fodder for entertainment that excluded their humanity. They were trapped not only in physical bondage, but in cultural narratives that erased sympathy, reducing their reality to caricature. And yet the very ubiquity of these images and jokes reveals something Athens did not intend: the sheer scale of the cruelty. If their suffering was so present in art theatre and graffiti, it means it was everywhere, woven into the daily life of the city. The laughter of audiences as the brushstrokes on pottery, the scratched lines on walls, all preserve fragments of a truth. Athens sought to normalize, but could not erase. This normalization of cruelty raises troubling questions. How could a society that gave the world philosophy, theatre, and democracy also turn women's suffering into entertainment? The answer lies not in contradiction, but in design. Athens built its identity by elevating some citizen men through the degradation of others. Entertainment became another means of reinforcing that hierarchy, reminding men of their power and women of their disposability. Today, as we admire Athenian art and celebrate its theatre, we must not overlook what these forms concealed and revealed. Behind the laughter of comedies and the elegance of painted vases lies a darker story. The suffering of women transformed into spectacle. Their pain was not hidden. It was displayed, consumed, and aestheticized until cruelty itself became culture. Athens is remembered as the cradle of democracy, a city where free citizens gathered to debate laws, vote on policy, and shape the destiny of their polis. But behind the gleaming marble of the Parthenon and the ideals carved into stone was an economy that thrived on human exploitation. The truth buried beneath centuries of reverence is that Athenian democracy was built in part on the backs of enslaved prostitutes whose suffering filled the city's coffers. Brothels were not shadowy corners of the city, but institutions regulated by the state. Taxes levied on these establishments flowed into the treasury just as reliably as levies on trade or agriculture. The laughter in symposia, the cheers in theatres, the prayers in temples, all were subsidized by a system that commodified women's bodies. The revenues funded roads, festivals, and even public works that today draw millions of tourists. The glory of Athens, so often praised, was intertwined with misery, carefully hidden in plain sight. Court speeches and financial records confirm this integration. Logographers like Lysias and Demosthenes mention brothel owners by name, noting their contributions to the city's income. Far from being excluded, the profits of sexual slavery were absorbed into the financial bloodstream of Athens. The state did not simply tolerate exploitation, it relied on it. Every taxed transaction became part of the city's democratic machinery, ensuring that citizens could enjoy festivals, games, and civic benefits. In this sense, the suffering of women was converted into the freedom of men. The juxtaposition is haunting. Picture the assembly on the Pnyx, where citizens debated lofty ideals of justice, freedom, and equality under law. Just a few streets away, women were branded beaten and forced into endless labor. The democracy that excluded women entirely depended on their exploitation to sustain itself. Their absence from the assembly was not a flaw in the system, it was its foundation, For Athenian men to be free women had to remain enslaved. Even the great monuments of Athens bear this stain. The Parthenon, a temple to Athena herself, was financed in part by tributes from allies and by revenues from within the city, including taxes on prostitution. While sculptors carved the goddess of wisdom in radiant marble women just beyond the temple precincts were forced into degrading rituals of violence. The marble endured, their bodies did not. Yet both were part of the same system. One immortalized, the other erased. Philosophers too bore silent witness to this contradiction. Socrates spoke of virtue in the agora, while the cries of enslaved women echoed from nearby brothels. Plato envisioned an ideal republic, but did not extend its justice to the women commodified in his own city. Aristotle dissected the nature of citizenship, declaring women and slaves inherently inferior, justifying their exclusion. These men who shaped the foundations of Western thought built their philosophies in a world sustained by systemic exploitation. The hypocrisy was not hidden from contemporaries. Satirical plays and court speeches occasionally mocked the reliance of wealthy men on their mistresses, or exposed the double lives of statesmen who preached virtue by day and indulged in cruelty by night. But such critiques rarely targeted the system itself. Instead, they reinforced it by treating individual excesses as comedy, while ignoring the structural violence at its core. What makes Athens unique is not that it exploited the vulnerable many societies have, but that it simultaneously exalted itself as the pinnacle of freedom. The very word demokratia implied rule by the people, yet the people excluded women, slaves and foreigners. The enslaved prostitutes of Athens experienced not democracy, but its inverse. A world where their labor and suffering underwrote the freedoms of others. And so the legacy of Athenian democracy is not simple. It gave the world a vocabulary of rights and citizenship. But it did so while erasing entire populations from those rights. The glory of Athens cannot be disentangled from its cruelty. To acknowledge this is not to dismiss its achievements, but to recognize their cost. The stones of the Parthenon are heavy, not only with beauty, but with silence. The silence of thousands of women whose lives were consumed to sustain the brilliance of a city that claimed to love freedom. Athens has long been remembered as the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and art. But the story of its enslaved prostitutes forces us to confront a harsher legacy. These women were silenced in life and erased in death, yet their presence lingers in the fragments left behind. Bones unearthed from rubbish pits, graffiti scratched on brothel walls, court speeches that mentioned them only as property. They were never meant to be remembered, and yet archaeology, literature, and law have preserved their faint echoes. What does it mean for civilization's greatness to be built on such silence and suffering? We celebrate Athens for the ideals of freedom and citizenship. Yet these ideals applied only to a narrow circle of men. Women's bodies became commodities, their pain converted into profit, their erasure woven into the very fabric of civic pride. The marble of the Parthenon and the eloquence of philosophers stand as monuments not only to human achievement, but also to the human cost hidden beneath them. This contradiction raises questions that remain relevant. How often do societies elevate themselves on the suffering of the marginalized? How often is cruelty normalized because it sustains beauty, wealth, or order for others? The Athenians justified their system by declaring women and slaves naturally inferior, unworthy of freedom. Today, we may shudder at the brutality of their reasoning, but echoes of it persist whenever exploitation is disguised as necessity, whenever voices are silenced to preserve comfort. The legacy of these women is not written in stone inscriptions or heroic verse, but in the quiet evidence recovered centuries later. Their bones tell us of violence. Their absence from civic memory tells us of erasure. Yet, by naming them now, by acknowledging their role in the story of Athens, we resist the silence imposed upon them. They remind us that history is not only the record of victors, but also the memory of the forgotten. Athens gave the world democracy, but it also gave us a warning freedom, proclaimed for some can coexist with bondage for others. To celebrate its ideals without confronting its exclusions is to repeat its blindness. The story of enslaved prostitutes compels us to ask whose suffering sustains our own societies today, whose voices are being erased so that others may stand in the light. These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones. For the greatness of any civilization is measured not only by what it builds, but by whom it chooses to forget. If you value stories that recover the silenced and confront the contradictions of history, consider subscribing to this channel. Together we can ensure that the ledger of the past is not closed until every forgotten voice is heard. Because when the monuments crumble, it is the bones, the whispers, and the unanswered questions that still speak.